And we'll be live in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Executive Committee meeting of the WMATA Board of Directors on March 25th, 2021. And before we begin, I'd like to ask our Chief Safety Officer, Teresa Impasado, to provide us with our safety contact. Good morning, Teresa.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics celebrates National Nutrition Month every March. This year, the focus of the campaign is personalize your plate with a healthy balance of different foods. As eating habits have shifted towards the reliance on processed foods over the past year as an effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's important to take the opportunity to reevaluate your diet and opt for healthy additions wherever possible. Visit eatright.org for tips and suggestions on how to enhance your diet and overall wellness. This concludes our morning safety contact.
Thank you, Ms. Impasado. Again, welcome everyone to today's Executive Committee meeting. Since this is our first meeting of the day, I'd like to ask the Board Corporate Secretary, Ms. Ellison, to call the roll. Ms. Ellison.
Thank you. Chair Smedberg.
Present.
Vice Chair Genevieve-Jenkins.
Present.
Vice Chair Goldman.
Present.
Director McMillan.
Present.
Director Letourneau.
Present.
Alternate Director Bulger.
Present.
Alternate Director Graham.
Present.
And Alternate Director Routh.
Present.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Ellison. Our first order of business this morning is to approve the agenda. If there are no objections, we'll consider the agenda approved as presented. Are there any objections by a committee member? Hearing none, the agenda is approved. Our next item, approval of the minutes. We have the minutes of our February 25th meeting before us for approval. Are there any objections or comments to the minutes as presented? Hearing none, we'll consider the minutes approved as well. This morning's action item is the acceptance of the OIG semi-annual report. Under the board's bylaws, the Executive Committee has the responsibility of reviewing and accepting audits and other reports by the Inspector General. The committee has reviewed the following reports: Inspector General Semi-Annual Report number 27. Before we take a vote, Mr. Charrington, WMATA IG, would you like to provide the committee with any highlights from the report?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. During the 6 months covered by this report, OIG investigative work resulted in 3 reports of investigation, 1 management alert, 1 management assistance report, and 3 special project reports. OIG issued 1 audit report that identified weaknesses in WMATA's program management involving a rail project. This report identified $62.9 million in funds that could be put to better use, including $23.6 million in net savings. Management has ongoing corrective actions that should correct the issues in this audit report. In addition, OIG issued the annual audit of WMATA's financial statements. OIG issued 19 contract audit reports with $8.3 million in possible savings. Based on an annual budget of $10.5 million over the 6-month period, OIG returned $7 to WMATA for every dollar spent. I'd like to commend the great efforts of the OIG staff, and I'd like to thank WMATA management and their staff for the collaborative efforts in implementing recommended corrective actions in a timely manner. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Charrington. I'll turn to the committee members first for any comments or questions. Mr. Golden.
Thank you again for your report, Mr. Charrington. I do have a question, and that really focuses on the back of your report, table 3, where you show the results from the hotline. Could you just go over the top 2 categories? I assume the first is an acronym for employee relations and labor, and the second one is safety issues. Could you describe what kinds of hotline calls you get under each of those categories?
Yes, sir. Under the employee relations or human resource, we receive complaints of hostile work environment, of situations in the office where an employee might not like their boss. Sometimes there's nepotism complaints, hiring discrimination complaints. Most of those complaints are provided to WMATA management to investigate. Sometimes if the OIG develops a pattern or finds some sort of conflict, we will investigate those matters, but most of them are referred to management. As far as safety concerns, first I'd like to note that we have an open pipeline to the chief safety officer with Metro and also to the safety commission, wherein if we, through our hotline or other source, receive any serious safety concern, we'll immediately notify those two offices and also the general manager. We receive safety complaints such as employees not wearing proper safety gear, for instance, out on the track, or from customers that have noticed things that they perceive as safety issues. And again, we correlate those, we refer them out as appropriate, or we'll investigate those that we feel we need to.
Thank you. And just for the record, in the executive session that preceded this one, I asked you to provide information on which of those kinds of hotline calls in those top two categories actually lead to investigations by your office, and what are the results of those specific investigations. And you agreed to provide that information to the board. So just want to confirm that for the record.
I did indeed, sir. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. Ms. Gideby Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Charrington, for your leadership and all that you've been doing to date and working with management. This time, I don't have any other additional questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Mr. McMillan.
No questions from me. Thank you, Mr. Charrington and Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Graham.
No questions. Thank you.
Let's see. I think we had Mr. Letourneau.
No questions.
Okay. Let's see. Whom else do we have with us? Devin, Mr. Rouse.
Yeah, good morning. Just one quick question for Mr. Charrington. On your report, we have the previous reports and the actions that have been taken. Is there any process or effort by which you go back to see if those corrective actions had the effect you were hoping they would have?
Yes, in fact, we go back, especially when they're critical parts. We will go back and check to make sure that the process not only has been stated in writing, but that it's actually been conducted. Yes.
Okay, thanks. I was just curious on that because I noticed you had your table of completed actions, and we seem to be making pretty good progress on most of them there. I was just curious if there's another process to see if they're actually having an effect. So thank you for that.
And Mr. Bolger.
I don't have any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Charrington, I have one question. Talk a little bit about process. Once you have this report, I know you work very closely and collaboratively with Mr. Wiedefeld and his team, but describe that a little bit to us, how that works once you have this information. How does it inform you moving forward, you and your team moving forward in other areas? How does that work?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. To develop our annual audit plan, the first thing we do is we engage Mr. Wiedefeld and his executive vice presidents. We ask each one to give us the top management challenges within their department. We also plan our audits around the general manager's goals and objectives for Metro, so safety, customer service, et cetera. We plan the audits around that. We also get audit ideas from our hotline complaints if there are any systemic issues that come through, and also through collaboration with our Office of Investigations. So that's how we plan our audit report. It's also very flexible. Should we get something that is hot at the moment or otherwise critical that comes in that's a new issue, we can add that to our audit report as well. So we try to remain flexible in that. As far as the investigations go, they're generally reactive, either through information we've developed through sources or through the hotline. So it's a little more difficult to plan on the investigative side. But the audit, we feel that we're addressing management challenges and what's critical to keep Metro safe, effective, and efficient.
Okay, thank you. Any final questions or comments from anyone? Okay. Acceptance of this report constitutes the board's authorization to post it on the WMATA website, provided that the Inspector General has conferred with the General Counsel and confirmed that any private or confidential information has been removed and or redacted in accordance with applicable law and WMATA policy. I would like to move approval of this item. Is there a second from a committee member?
Second, Mr. Chairman.
Seconded by Mr. Goldman. I'll ask Ms. Ellison to please call the roll. Ms. Ellison.
Chair Smedberg,
Aye.
Vice Chair Gideby Jenkins,
Aye.
Vice Chair Goldman,
Aye.
Director McMillan.
Aye.
Mr. Chair, the motion passes.
Thank you, Ms. Ellison. The report has been accepted and the Inspector General has been authorized to post it online. Since there's no further business to come before this committee, we stand adjourned. Now we will begin the Board of Directors meeting shortly. September, my goodness, March 25th, 2021. Good morning, I'm Paul Smedberg, Chair of the WMATA Board. Thank you for being with us here this morning. I'd like to ask the Secretary, Ms. Ellison, to call the roll. Ms. Ellison?
Chair Smedberg,
Present.
Vice Chair Gideby Jenkins,
Present.
Vice Chair Goldman,
Present.
Director McMillan,
Here.
Director Letourneau,
Present.
Alternate Director Bolger, Alternate Director Graham,
Present.
Alternate Director Rouse.
Present.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Ellison. Now we'll move to the approval of the agenda. If there are no objections, I'd like to consider the agenda approved as presented. Are there any objections? Hearing none, the agenda is approved as presented. Next, we'll move on to the approval of the minutes. We have 3 sets of minutes before us this morning for approval. First, the February 25th, 2021 board meeting, the February 25th, 2021 executive session, and the March 11th, 2021 executive session. I'd like to consider these minutes approved as presented, but first I'll ask if there are any comments, corrections, or objections to any of those sets of minutes. Hearing none, the minutes are approved as presented. Thank you. Next, we'll move on to the employee spotlight. I'll ask Mr. Wiedefeld to introduce our honoree bus operator, Robert Miles. Mr. Wiedefeld.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. Today, we recognize an outstanding employee who recently reached the 50 years of service mark. Bus operator Robert Miles moved to the region in 1969 and found a job with the Washington, Marlboro, and Annapolis Transit Company, known as WMA. The company had bus lines that served eastern side of the service area. But on his first day, Mr. Miles quickly realized that having just moved from North Carolina, he didn't know enough about the local streets to be a successful bus operator. So he went to work elsewhere, learning the roads and safe operations in multiple driving jobs that took him all across DC, Maryland, and Virginia. With that knowledge under his belt, Mr. Miles rejoined WMA in 1971, officially beginning his transit career. Shortly afterwards, in 1973, the newly created Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority took over WMA and merged its services with DC Transit, another bus operator in the area. Since then, Mr. Miles has served as a Metro bus operator and line platform instructor, which has allowed him to share his knowledge, skills, and insights with newly hired employees. After nearly 40 years of service in 2010, Mr. Miles briefly retired from Metro. However, he had a desire to continue serving the community and returned in 2011 as a part-time operator. With 50 years of service now under his belt, Mr. Miles' safety record is impeccable. He has won Metro's annual bus rodeo skills-based competition a whopping 27 times. And he's safely driven more than 3 million miles over the past 42 years. That's the equivalent of driving around the Capitol Beltway over 46,000 times without a preventable accident. Please join me in congratulating Mr. Miles on his 50th anniversary at Metro. We're fortunate to have a safety rock star like him here at Metro, setting a great example for the next generation of Metro bus operators to follow. Thank you, Mr. Miles, for everything you've done for the community.
You're welcome. And I'd like to thank you all very much for having me here and recognizing me for my 50 years of service. And I think Mr. Wienerfield said about all of it. And I'm not a speaker, but I can drive the bus safe, take people where they want to go, treat them like they're supposed, like I want to be treated, and take one block at a time safe. And that's how I did for my 50 years of service. If I can take the bus out, I want to bring it back the same way I took it out. And just continue doing the work safe and be here for a few more years, as long as I'm healthy and strong. And thank y'all very much for having me here. Okay?
Mr. Wiedefeld, any final comments?
Mr. Miles, it's nice to see you again, sir. And I'm so glad that to see you. I just hope I look as good as you after working here 50 years.
Thank you very much, sir.
Well, Mr. Miles, I just have to say congratulations. What an amazing record, and one that you should definitely be extremely proud of. And I know hearing about this yesterday from Mr. Wiedefeld and a few others, how proud they are that someone like you is working for this system and sets such an amazing example for others. And it's just really heartfelt, the comments I've heard, and really incredible, and says a lot about you, not only as a skilled bus driver, but as a person, which is really, just says it all for me personally. So anyone else like to say anything? Ms. Gideby Jenkins?
Yes, I also want to echo my appreciation and also just put it into the context of the tenure of our country during the time in which you started to serve. It was a time in which, we were just ensuring that we had equal services. And so to be able to see a face that looked like yours on the bus definitely made the difference. And as a rider, one of the things that helps to get my day started is being able to see that familiar face. And for many years, you were able to be that familiar face on many routes. And you've seen children, parents, people continue to grow through the years. And so it's beautiful because I'm not sure that people fully understand, especially for Metro Bus. You all are the faces that folks get to see each morning and each night sometimes, and being able to get to where they need to go to, and having someone who serves with pride, someone who is dedicated, who wakes up every morning early before we do to ensure that we can get to where we need to go to, is really that legacy that we want other employees to really understand, that you all are really the face of ensuring that someone has a good day. And so I just thank you for your service. I thank you for your safety record, but I thank you for also what you have done over these last years, and just ensuring that Metro is a place that people want to be able to not just come to work to, but also to be able to ride. And it's critical to have faces like yours as well as part of the story. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gideby Jenkins. Does anyone else like to make any comments?
Sure, Paul, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Michael. Yeah.
Mr. Miles, good to see you. I'm sure since you were driving back in 1971, 1972, I probably was one of your customers back then when I was originally a citizen in Washington, taking the bus to work downtown as well. But what I wanted to ask you about was that Mr. Wiedefeld had remarked and mentioned that you're one of our bus rodeo champions. And it's a very impressive record, but I think it would be helpful for some of my colleagues on the board and the public at large to understand better what happens in these bus rodeos, and in what kind of events are actually held. And if you're the champion, your skill at operating a bus is one that you should be proud of, and you should now tell some of my colleagues and the public at large what these contests involve and how you performed. So I'll give you the floor as a rodeo champion.
Well, these contests are really hard because you're competing between Canada, Hawaii, all over the United States. Plus, you got good operators all over the place. And it's time and skill. You make one mistake, you lose out. Like one time I made a mistake, I came in second place. I missed it from tying it by 1 point, missed it from winning it by 2 points. But you got all skilled operators doing the same thing I'm doing. And it's mostly luck and skill, which I try to do every day doing my work. I try to remember some of the skills that I need to do and continue doing it while I'm at work every day. So that helps me keep my competition going. But most of it's luck and skill, I think. Thank you.
What I want you to tell them about is some of the skills involved. I'm sure you're not, as in a horse rodeo, on a bucking bus or anything like that. I guess it's a kind of an obstacle course that you're running as one of the events.
Right, that's right. Yeah, you start out making maybe the right hand turn or the left hand turn, some of your driving skills, and putting it out there. And it's all about turning and handling the bus safe. And that's the main thing about it that I see. Because if you don't handle it safe, mainly during the whole year, you will not qualify to even be in the rodeos. So it helps your skill on your service the whole year through. So what are some of the obstacles?
Mr. Miles is being
Cutthroat.
yeah, at the very end of that, Mr. Miles, as you know, you have to get up to 25 miles an hour. You have to go between these huge barrels. You cannot hit any of the barrel, and you have to stop within a certain distance. Literally, it's just amazing to watch when we do this. In fact, when we normally do it, we have it open to the public so they can see it. But it is a very, very tough rodeo for him to compete in. And again, he's competing internationally.
That's true. Very tough. And you got a lot of competition. Very tough, yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miles.
You're welcome. All right.
Well, Mr. Miles, it really is again, a remarkable record, and one that you should obviously be very proud of. And, on behalf of the entire board, just, a heartfelt thank you for your service and dedication and your continued engagement with WMATA here. Obviously, like you said, you've got a few more years in you, so that'll be quite a record. And again, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
All right, and thank you for being with us here this morning.
Thank you.
Next, we'll move on to public comment and the advisory board reports. First, we'll hear from our customers who submitted comments for the board. We received only one comment this month that wasn't directly related to the proposed fiscal year 2022 budget. I'll ask staff to read the comment now. Thank you.
The one comment we received was from Bob Walsh of Montgomery County, Maryland. Cutting the 16Y was a bad idea. I was able to go from Farragut North to 2310 Columbia Pike without a problem. You need to replace it. That concludes our public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Pasick. Next, we'll hear from the Accessibility Advisory Chair, Phil Posner. Mr. Posner, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Phil. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, spring has arrived, and so the weather's getting good. In addition to that, the federal COVID relief is moving forward, and that's another good sign. And the inoculations are continuing to go forward. So it's just all good news for this month. And hopefully things are going to continue to get better and we'll get back to normal. We just completed the input phase of the budget. And we want to thank you for running an accessible, effective budget hearing and many, many methods for the public to issue their comments. And I think both the board and the public were aware that this was a worst case scenario, but it was handled very well. And we thank you for that. Earlier this month, along with Pat Sheehan, I attended the RAC meeting. And at that meeting, Ms. Impestado and Chief Pavlik presented information on their division's responses to COVID and safety. And I wanted to particularly thank them for the work they have done to improve the communication with the low vision, blind, and deaf communities. They're aware of some of the problems and they're doing a great job. And I think it's nice for us to tell them they're doing a good job instead of people constantly complaining. Like to also congratulate WMATA on finalizing the 8,000 series contract. We hope that we can continue giving input on the needed accessibility features, such as effective door lighting, priority seating placement, and usability and wheelchair mobility. We constantly have had good contact with Mr. Leader on communicating AAC bus and rail issues and things that affect the senior and disability communities. And we hope that we'll still be able to have that type of input when it comes to the final design and implementation of the 8,000 series cars. The new Metro Access vehicle purchase process is underway for vans and sedans. And once again, we're delighted that the lessons learned from the earlier processes, which I complained about last month, are being implemented. So kudos to ADAP and procurement for taking those lessons learned and going forward with what appears to be a really good process. And then finally, we do have a request for WMATA, and that is to ask you to study the net positives of implementing the use of flat fares for Metro Access riders. Currently, it's done with the fare calculator, which we really helped support and set up. The problem with the fare calculator we learned is the information in the calculator is only updated every 6 months. And with the constant work that's currently going on with improvements and station improvements, route changes, and what have you, it's out of date with a lot of the information they have. And so it causes a lot of unrest with the public because they don't understand the fares that they're getting. And it takes a lot of time of Metro staff to try to explain what's going on. And I think if you calculate the difference in fare box recovery from a flat fare versus using the fare calculator, is a real net positive for WMATA. And we're asking you to take a look at it at this time. And that's my report for this month. It's all positives. You guys are doing a great job as always. So thank you so much and happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Phil. Appreciate those words. Are there any questions for Mr. Posner? Anyone? Tom? Mr. Bolger?
Yeah, Phil, thank you for your report. Always insightful. Since congestion levels have dropped dramatically, in fact, our metropolitan area has the highest drop in congestion ever in the country. Wouldn't the Metro Access vehicles be able to transverse less traffic and therefore be more effective?
Oh, yes. In fact, if you look at the monthly numbers, their on-time performance is incredible. If you remember last quarter, or last year actually, they had dropped down to an 85% on-time performance rate. And their standard is 92%, or actually 90%. And now they're close to 98% on-time performance. So they're incredible. And what they're doing again for COVID is their direct delivery to location. There's one passenger and at most personal attendant with them. And so it's almost a direct shuttle. So the on-time performance is terrific. It's going to be hard for the customers to get back to normal when everybody starts using it. But again, hopefully with the implementation of Abilities Ride, when it comes back online, they'll be able to maintain their effort. This is going to be one of the best systems around. You may or may not know, I spend a part of the time of the year in Gainesville, Florida, at the university. And to compare their local access system with what we have in DC, there's no comparison. It's night and day. So they're doing a wonderful job. And Mr. Blake tells me not to single out single people, but he's doing a good job. And he'll yell at me later for doing that.
So Phil, just to follow up, does the fare calculator take into consideration on-time performance?
No, it doesn't. What it does do is it calculates the lowest fare that occurs during the 1 hour period that the customer can make the reservation. If you remember, and you were there when we implemented it, there were something like 200,000 different permutations of fares that occur between bus, rail, different schedules, different times of the day, which made it almost impossible for the individual customer to know what was happening. And so the calculator was put in to come up with the best fare and the lowest fare, which has worked really well. But the problem right now is the fare calculated is the lowest fare based on the availability of bus or rail in a particular location. And because so many of the rail stations are being shut down, that's not being calculated. They're being assumed to still be in service. So that's why we're thinking the flat fare. And right now, the numbers that we have gotten, 2/3 of the riders are paying the lowest fare, 1/3 are paying the highest fare, and the median fare is about $4.75. And so a flat fare of $4.75 or $5 would not change the fare box recovery for WMATA. And it's about the same that accessibility ride is available. So the passengers, even though they'd be paying a little more at the lower end, the fact that they know what they're paying so they could plan their budgets and know what they had to have available would be worth it. That's the input we've gotten in our committee from the committee members and from the public. So there's a general feeling that financially it won't hurt WMATA at all. And the plus of certainty for the passenger is worth the extra amount that they might have to pay.
Final question, Phil, is Tom again. Would you consider putting in on-time performance into this calculation?
One of the things we've asked for, and actually the Inspector General has put that in, is on-time performance previously had been on time for pickup, not on time for delivery. And one of the things that we would love to have in is the recording of both where you picked up on time and where you delivered on time. Right now, with only one passenger per trip, the on-time delivery is great. One of the things that WMATA will have to consider once the Silver Line opens up is some of the trips are going to be really long from Maryland out to Dulles Airport and beyond. And so I think a new calculation is going to have to be made, but I definitely think the amount of time people spend on the vehicle, as well as whether they're picked up on time, are two critical things that should be considered.
Okay, thanks, Phil.
Thank you. You always ask such good questions.
Just trying to be Uber-esque about Metro access.
Well, actually, with the Abilities Ride, Uber is now included as one of the services that are working. So you're right on spot with that.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you, Mr. Bolger. Is there anyone else? Any questions for Mr. Posner? All right. Thank you, Phil. Appreciate your time.
Super. Thank you so much.
Nice work. Next, we move on to the Riders Advisory Council Chair, Rob Caves. Robert, good morning.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Since it's my first time addressing the board, I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Rob Caves, the RAC's Vice Chair for the District of Columbia, serving as the chair, and I've been on the RAC for just over 2 years now. Members of the RAC last met March 3rd. We welcomed 4 new members to the council, so I'm happy to report membership is now up to full strength, representing all 3 jurisdictions, coming from diverse backgrounds with the goal of advising the board on the interests of riders through the entire Metro system. At this meeting, we also welcome the attendance of Board Vice Chair Stephanie Gidby Jenkins, who started what we hope will be an ongoing dialogue on enhanced collaboration between the RAC and the board. We greatly appreciated this outreach and look forward to future opportunities to engage on this topic. As the RAC, we're also looking internally at ways to increase our contributions and share feedback with the board in a constructive way. One example we've discussed is more closely aligning RAC discussions with board discussions to generate more timely, relevant interaction. And we welcome suggestions from the board on areas where the RAC can contribute to board discussions to ensure our efforts are well spent. At that meeting, the RAC also heard from WMATA's Chief Operating Officer, Chief Safety Officer, and the Chief of the Metro Transit Police Department on safety protocols resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. And just to echo some of Phil's compliments, we really appreciate the difficult, challenging work of ensuring safety across the entire system. Recognize the burden this places on staff and budget. It's truly extraordinary times, and we recognize that. We do hear from riders, they view mask compliance as one of their top safety concerns. And so continued efforts to increase compliance while maintaining operator safety is a key element to bringing riders back to the system. Another element that we've discussed is improving service levels, which we're hopeful will be possible given the recent announcement of federal funding in the American Recovery Plan. And we look forward to hearing about any changes in planned service levels going forward. As the region progresses in its vaccination campaign and as workplaces and businesses gradually reopen, residents will be evaluating their transportation options. Thank you. That concludes the RAC's report for March.
Thank you, Robert. Any questions or comments for the RAC chair? Ms. Gidby Jenkins, any? All right. Thank you, Robert, and we very much look forward to working with you. Congratulations on your new role.
Thank you.
Take care. Now we'll move to the chair's report. First, I'd like to thank everyone who took the time to provide us with their feedback on the fiscal year 2022 budget. With the passage of additional COVID relief funding, Metro can avert the painful service cuts and layoffs that were proposed when we began the public process in January. Congress, and especially our regional delegation, once again stepped up to address the needs of Metro and the regional transit systems that will be critical to our region's economic recovery. For that, we are very grateful. To the more than 18,000 individuals who provided the board with feedback on our fiscal year 2022 budget, please know your feedback is extremely helpful, and we will use that as we plan for the future. We will vote on the revised fiscal year 2022 budget next month that takes into consideration this new federal relief. This concludes my report. Now I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Wiedefeld, our general manager, for his report. Mr. Wiedefeld.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. Actually, I want to follow up a bit on some of the comments that you just made, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, earlier this month, Congress and the Biden administration stepped up to support transit as part of the American Rescue Plan. The latest COVID relief legislation includes funding that will allow Metro to avert proposed service reductions and layoffs. Particularly the layoffs is a particular concern to me. This relief is only possible thanks to the leadership of the entire congressional delegation, who fought tirelessly for transit workers and for the riders. While the financial pressures due to COVID has diminished, the input we receive from the individuals across the region remains incredibly valuable as we prepare for Metro's recovery. I want to update some of the numbers that you just gave, if I could, because they literally have been they've been changing as we pull this together. I want to thank more than 22,000 individuals and organizations that provided feedback on the proposed budget during the public comment period. That's the most comments we've received on a budget in at least 10 years, and among the most diverse populations to engage with us. In-person outreach teams interacted with more than 43,000 customers, with nearly 1 in every 5 interactions conducted in Spanish. On the digital side, we had more than 26,000 unique visitors to the budget webpage at WMATA.com to learn more about the proposal and complete the online survey. All this public input will be taken into consideration as we revise the fiscal year 22 budget and consider the future of Metro, as you just mentioned, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the entire board for their support as we tested new outreach tactics to expand our budget outreach impact, particularly during this terrible period of COVID. In particular, I did want to thank Director Kitty Jenkins, whose leadership to push and expand traditional outreach efforts helped us reach not only current and lapsed riders, but also groups that had historically been harder to reach. Next month, we will return to the board to discuss our updated budget proposals, which will incorporate the additional federal funding. Moving to the capital program, continuing the positive news again this month. Last week, we announced the selection of Hitachi Rail to build the Metro's 8,000 series rail cars in the United States. The base order will replace Metro's aging 2000 and 3000 series rail cars, which have been in service since the early 1980s. These new rail cars will build on the success of the 7000 series cars, which make up more than half of the fleet, and incorporate the latest technology and features for even better rider experiences. The 8000 series rail cars are funded using the new dedicated revenue streams established by DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Building on the region's commitment to the Metro's long-term future, the procurement process encouraged reinvestment of local tax dollars in the regional economy. As a result, Hitachi plans to add a railcar assembly plant in the region, which would create direct and indirect jobs and return Metro's investment to the local economy. So we're very pleased with that, as you can imagine. But also, as we look ahead to the next generation of Metro's rail cars, I also want to take a moment to look back at one of Metro's original constructors, who we recently lost to the coronavirus. Last week, the Washington Post reported Robert S. O'Neill, the chief engineer for the contracting firm that built the original Metro rail system in the 1960s and 70s, had passed away in February. After serving 2 years in the Air Force, Mr. O'Neill earned a civil engineering degree from the University of Notre Dame and later a master's degree in engineering from Catholic University. He went on to work for Duluth Cather, which later became Parsons Corporation, one of the main contractors building the Metro system. Mr. O'Neill ran the company's transportation group for a decade before retiring, playing a significant role in infrastructure projects across the Washington region and the nation and internationally. His legacy wasn't just limited to transit either in the region. Mr. O'Neill was also worked on other mega projects like the redesign of the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. This tragic loss is another reminder that we must do everything we can to limit the spread of COVID-19 and to help protect those we love as well as ourselves. That includes wearing a mask, reducing high-risk activities, and signing up to receive the vaccine when available. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. That concludes my remarks for today.
Thank you, Mr. Wiedefeld. Are there any comments or questions for the General Manager?
Yeah, Paul.
Yes, Bolger. Yep.
Paul, great report. Just curiosity, where do you think the Hitachi assembly facility will be located?
That will be a decision by the company. They will do their due diligence. As you can imagine, they have a number of parameters they have to meet, just in terms of physical size, environmental, all those types of issues. So they will do that. I would assume that will take a bit of time. So they are in there, they're doing their process. And when they reach that conclusion, they will let us know.
Do you think it'll be like an Amazon event?
It's very big, obviously, for the region to have a manufacturer building these cars in this region. I think that's very big, yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. Bolger. Anyone else? Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, yes, go ahead, Mr. Grant.
Paul, thank you for the report. For the public's benefit, could you talk through what some of the changes they'll see with these new rail cars?
We're going to basically build off of obviously the 7000s and a lot of the positives we got from there. But probably the biggest thing that you'll notice, the public will notice, is a lot of the technology, because between the screens and what you can do now and what you'll be able to do. Remember, these cars aren't coming online for almost 3 years. So you can imagine with the technology advancements. So we're looking to do that. We're looking internationally what has been done and incorporate that. We will be doing things more for the air filtration system. We'll be looking to make them lighter. We will work, as Phil mentioned earlier, we will work with his group to make sure that we're incorporating, any thoughts that his community has to make sure that's in there. So I think from the customer perspective, it will be more the technology. You'll be able to recharge your phones. So there'll be plugs to do that. So a lot of the basic customer things that we've heard from people that they love with the 7,000 and taking that to the next level.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. All right, and Mr. Wiedefeld, please pass along our appreciation to Ms. Bowersock and her team for the outreach. I mean, it really has been really a whole new level, this time around, and obviously, the potential cuts and layoffs obviously had potentially something to do with that, given the financial constraints that we were possibly facing. But still, and Ms. Gideby Jenkins really did push us in this area. So thank you to her, and please pass along our thanks to her team with those efforts. So, all right, thank you. Now we'll move on to the report from the Finance and Capital Committee. Mr. McMillan.
Thank you. This is Steve McMillan, Chair of the Finance and Capital Committee. The following item was referred to the board at the March 11th Finance and Capital Committee meeting. FY 2021 Capital Budget Amendment and Debt Issuance Authorization. In February, staff sought approval to amend the FY 2021 capital budget to increase funding by $255 million to support platform reconstruction projects, a schedule adjustment for the Potomac Yard Station project, and for information technology equipment to support remote work and cybersecurity during the pandemic. Staff also sought authorization at that time to negotiate or competitively sell dedicated funding-backed bonds. At the March 11th Finance Committee meeting, the committee approved an increase in the amount of bonds Metro would be allowed to sell at this time to an amount not to exceed $874 million in principal. I would note that this higher amount represents an acceleration of borrowing requirements already identified for a portion of fiscal year 2022, not an increase in the total amount of planned borrowing. Mr. Chairman, I move approval of both the capital budget amendment and the bond sale authorization.
Thank you, Mr. McMillan. Mr. McMillan has put a motion on the table. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Bolger. Okay, now that we have a motion and a second, we'll move on to discussion. Ms. Gideby Jenkins, any questions or comments? Okay, we'll come back to Stephanie. Mr. Goldman.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I think in earlier iterations of this budget amendment and bond authorizations, I had expressed some reservations, but fortunately, the passage of the American Rescue legislation by Congress earlier this month makes it possible for me to more enthusiastically support this amendment at this time. I support both the budget amendment that will allow the platform work to go forward this summer, which is so important to a number of stations in Prince George's County. And I support the acceleration of the bond ordinance at the increased level of $874 million, and agree with the staff recommendation to proceed with this accelerated level now to take advantage of the low rates that are available in the marketplace. However, I must note that before we approve the other $500 million in borrowing for the capital program for fiscal year 2022, yes, that's right, our budget for fiscal year 2022 that we will formally consider next month assumes that we will be borrowing roughly $1 billion using dedicated funding for the capital program. That before we go forward with that second tranche of $500 million, $500 million, that we fully consider alternatives so that access to the dedicated funding mechanism does not run out in FY 27 as the future budget projections show, when interest and debt carrying charge would hit about $360 million of the $500 million that's available each year as dedicated funding. That gets too close to the maximum level of borrowing And I think it's in the board's interest and the area's interest that we maintain the dedicated funding mechanism available for years beyond FY27 to finance capital projects in the budget and capital projects that will be developed over the next 4 or 5 years. So in that respect, I think over the next few months, we should be considering other alternatives to using dedicated funding for the other $500 million in the budget, such as federal TIFIA loan program, private placement, or perhaps a use of some part of the approximately $1 billion that will be made available to WMATA as a result of the American Rescue legislation signed by President Biden earlier this month. So we can stretch out our use of dedicated funding and keep that alive as a valuable funding vehicle well into the next decade. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will be supporting the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. You made some good points there. Mr. McMillan.
I have nothing further to add. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Letourneau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I am supportive of this as well. I appreciate the work of our staff and financial advisors to look at what's most advantageous for the authority in terms of timing on our bond sales. Ultimately, almost regardless of what we need to do or what we do budgetarily, we will need to access this funding to complete projects in the capital program. So it makes sense to consolidate when we think the market will be more favorable and have that ability to do that. So I will support the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Letourneau. Mr. Bolger.
Steve, thank you, Paul. Sorry, one of our phones is ringing. Just let it ring.
No worries.
Steve, have you considered any more input about a TIFIA loan alternative to long-term financing as we discussed in the committee?
I'm sorry, Tom, that question's addressed to me.
Yeah, I wanted to address it to the chair of the committee.
I see.
Rather than just a general comment. Remember, we talked about a possible TIFIA idea going forward. And I remember saying, why didn't we have some kind of a discussion with the federal DOT about exploring the TIFIA alternative? Has anything more happened about that?
I do not have anything scheduled in the committee at this time, but we will engage with staff and make sure that that the board's fully informed of the opportunities and what that kind of approach would entail for us as it relates to our current financing scheme. So yes, Tom, thank you for raising that, and we will be addressing that in the near future.
Well, Steve, I'm willing to reach out to Polly Trottenberg, the second in command at DOT, a good friend of mine, if that's necessary.
Sure, appreciate that, and we'll stay in touch on this.
All right, thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Bolger. Mr. Graham.
I have no comment at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nothing more from me.
Okay. And Ms. Gita B. Jenkins, any questions or comments? I see you're back.
Sorry about that. Yes. No questions or comments at this time. The only thing I just wanted to reiterate was from the comments from last or 2 weeks ago, and just making sure that as we think about what the final numbers will be in the approval of this issuance, just making sure that we are also thinking about the most advantageous approach to ensure that we have greater diversity of the team that will be pulled together as part of this for the approach that we're going to use. So I just wanted to bring that in as well.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. All right, we have a motion on the table by Mr. McMillan. It is seconded by Mr. Bolger. Ms. Ellison, please call the roll.
Chair Smedberg?
Aye.
Vice Chair Gita B. Jenkins?
Aye.
Vice Chair Goldman?
Aye.
Mr. McMillan?
Sorry, aye.
Mr. Letourneau?
Aye.
Mr. Bolger?
Aye.
Mr. Graham,
Aye.
Mr. Rouse.
Aye.
Mr. Chair, the motion passes.
Thank you, Ms. Ellison. Now we'll move on to reports by the jurisdictions in BTC. I personally don't have anything. Mr. Letourneau, anything for NBTC?
No, I don't think there's anything new. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. For the District of Columbia, Ms. Giddy Jenkins.
I just wanted to thank the WMATA leadership for participating in the district council's oversight hearing last Tuesday. The general manager presented an overview of all of the things that we've been doing to date. I think that there was great interest in wanting to see us move forward on a bolder sustainability plan. I look forward to working with the Metro staff team. One of the things that we committed to last fall was to be able to bring a sustainability plan forward that really spoke to greater goals that the region has already been pushing as part of that narrative. And I hope that we'll continue to advance that work. But overall, I just want to thank the general manager and also OIG Charrington for participating in the conversation and ensuring that we had great representation on the things that we've been doing to date.
Thank you, Stephanie. WSTC, Mr. Goldman.
Yes, nothing to report of substance other than go Maryland women in the NCAA tournament. And I'll pass the baton to my colleague, Mr. Graham, to see if he has anything from the secretary to report.
I have nothing in addition to report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And finally, the federal government, Mr. McMillan.
No report this time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. With no further business to come before the board, we stand adjourned and we will move to executive session. In accordance with the bylaws, I, Paul Smedberg, request that the Board of Directors convene an executive session to discuss the following matters pursuant to Article 2, Paragraph 9, subsections A, budgetary matters that may affect legal positions, WMATA contracts, or sensitive relationships with local jurisdictions and the federal government, and C, personnel or labor issues, including discussion of labor contracts and labor negotiations, consideration or interviews of candidates for employment, and the assignment, appointment, promotion, performance, demotion, or resignation of individuals, and F, safety and security matters where premature release would compromise public safety. Is there a second?
Second, Mr. Chairman.
Seconded by Mr. Goldman. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you. We will now convene an executive session. Thank you for joining us this morning.